She abandoned her sick father. My mother set it into a room full of our relatives, one hand pressed to her heart, the other pointing straight at me. We were standing at the foot of my father's hospital bed, on the oncology floor of St. Brendan's Medical Center. There was a wicker basket going around the room, the kind you'd see at a church raffle, and one by one my aunts and uncles and cousins were dropping folded 20s into it for his treatment. My Aunt Deborah wouldn't look at me. My cousin Trevor actually gasped, like a boy in a school play. And my father, hooked to 3 IV lines with a blood pressure cuff sighing on his arm, turned his face toward the window so he wouldn't have to see me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I had spent 11 days learning how not to do either of those things in public. So when the basket finally reached me, passed hand to hand until my mother's sister held it out with 2 fingers like it might bite her, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat, took out a single folded piece of paper, and dropped it in instead of cash. I'd been carrying that paper for those 11 days. It had gone soft at the creases from my thumb. The nurse who emptied that basket an hour later would unfold it, read it, go very still, and walk straight out of the room to find my father's doctor. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if I get ahead of myself, you'll miss the part that matters. Which is how a woman who paid for every single day of her father's cancer treatment ended up being the villain of his fundraiser. If you've ever been the family member everyone decided to hate before they knew the facts, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you, and I promise the ending is worth staying for. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. My name is Monica. I'm 31 years old. And to explain how I got to the foot of that hospital bed, with a receipt in my pocket, instead of an excuse in my mouth, I have to take you back about 2 years, to the Sunday my parents decided I was no longer their daughter. It didn't happen over something dramatic. That's the part people never believe. There was no screaming match, no thrown plate, no secret affair discovered. It happened over a co-signature. My younger brother Danny had gotten himself into a lease for a restaurant space he could not afford, in a part of the city where 3 restaurants had already died that year. He needed a co-signer with good credit and a steady job. I had both. I worked then, and I work now, as a patient financial counselor. My whole job, 40 hours a week, is sitting across a desk from people on the worst day of their lives and explaining exactly what a hospital will and won't do to them financially and how to survive it. I read statements the way other people read street signs. I know what a lien is. I know what happens when a business defaults and the co-signer's name is on the paper. So when my mother called and told me Danny needed me to sign, I said no. I didn't say no cruelly. I offered to sit down with Danny and go through the numbers. I offered to help him find a smaller space, a better lease, a partner. I offered everything except my signature on a document that would have made me personally responsible for $140,000 I would never see a cent of. My mother listened to all of that, and then she said the sentence that ended the first version of my family. She said, "So you'd rather your brother fail than risk a little of your precious money? I want you to hear how that works, because it's the engine of everything that came after. In my mother's world, love was proven by what you were willing to lose. If you weren't willing to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, you didn't love them. And a person who reads statements for a living, a person who says the numbers out loud instead of pretending they don't exist, that person isn't careful. That person is cold. That person is the enemy." Danny got a different co-signer eventually, a friend from culinary school, and the restaurant closed in 14 months, exactly like I said it would. But by then, the story had already hardened around me. I was the daughter who wouldn't help. I was the one who thought she was better than the family because she had a desk job and a savings account. My mother told that story at every holiday, at every birthday, on every phone call to every relative, and she told it so well and so often that people who had known me my entire life began to look at me the way you look at a stain on a nice tablecloth. My father didn't defend me. That's the wound underneath all the other wounds, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. My father was a quiet man. He had spent 41 years as a union electrician, and he believed the way he believed in gravity, that a household had one voice, and that voice was my mother's. When she decided I was cold, he decided it too. Or at least he decided not to argue about it, which, from the receiving end, feels exactly the same. At the last Thanksgiving I was invited to, he passed me the potatoes without meeting my eyes, and when I said, "Dad, can we talk after?" he said, "Your mother's got a headache, we're leaving early." And that was the last full sentence my father said to me for a year and a half. So when I tell you that in November of last year I got a voicemail from my Aunt Deborah, not from my parents, my aunt, telling me that my father had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, you'll understand why my first feeling wasn't grief. My first feeling was that cold, sick drop you get when you already know how a story is going to be told, and you already know you're going to be the villain of it. I want to stop here and tell you what I did next, because everything my mother said about me hangs on this moment, and I need you to have it before she gets to lie about it. I called the hospital, not my mother. The hospital, St. Brendan's, where he'd been admitted, because I know how this works. I know that acute myeloid leukemia in a 63-year-old man means induction chemotherapy, means weeks as an inpatient, means a bill that climbs $1,000 an hour while everyone's too scared to look at it. And I knew my parents. I knew my mother handled the money, and I knew from 20 years of watching that my mother handled money the way a house fire handles a curtain. The woman in St. Brendan's financial services office was named Rosa, and Rosa and I speak the same language. So it took her about 90 seconds to understand that I was a colleague from another system, and about 4 minutes to understand that I was terrified. She couldn't tell me much. Privacy laws are privacy laws, and I'd have been the first to enforce them at my own desk. But she could tell me that a self-pay balance existed on the account, and she could take a payment from anyone who wanted to make one, and she could apply it to the oldest charges first. That was the door I needed. That was the only door they'd left open. So on the 4th of December, I made my first payment on my father's cancer treatment. It was $4,000, which was most of what I could move that week without touching my emergency fund. And I made it over the phone with Rosa, reading me the confirmation number in a voice that had gone gentle. I wrote the confirmation number on a yellow sticky note, and I stuck it inside a manila folder. And that manila folder is the second thing you need to remember, because that folder is going to walk into a hospital conference room in about 14,000 words and end my mother's entire life as she'd built it. But on the 4th of December, it was just a folder with one sticky note in it, and me sitting in my car in a parking garage, shaking, because I had just spent $4,000 on a man who had passed me the potatoes without looking at me. Here's the first question I want you to sit with, and I mean really sit with it, because I asked it of myself every single day for the next 7 months. Why would you pay for someone who won't even say your name? I told myself it was because he was my father, and that was reason enough. That was half true. The other half, the half I didn't want to look at, was that some stubborn, stupid, hopeful part of me thought that if I just kept him alive long enough, there would come a day when the fog lifted, and he looked at me and remembered that before I was the cold one, I was the little girl who used to hand him wire nuts out of his tool bucket and get to keep the empty ones. I was paying for a conversation I wasn't sure I'd ever get to have. That's the truth of it. Write it down. I made the second payment on the 18th of December. $6,200, Rosa again. Another sticky note. Now, here's where I have to teach you one thing about my job, because you're going to need it, and I promise I'll be quick. When a patient can't pay, hospitals don't just eat the whole cost and smile. They have a thing called charity care, financial assistance, and it's real. And most people who qualify for it never apply because nobody tells them it exists. Part of my actual job is telling them. So while I was making these payments, I was also, quietly, doing the thing I do all day for strangers. I was building my father a financial assistance application. I gathered what I could get: income thresholds, asset limits, the forms St. Brendan's used, which I could get because they're public. Hospitals are required to publish them, and that's when I found the first thing that didn't add up. To qualify a patient for charity care, you document their income and their assets. My father was a retired union electrician with a pension, and I knew for a fact a retirement account he'd been building for 4 decades. He used to talk about it at every holiday, back when I was still invited. 40 years I put in that account, he'd say, tapping the table. That's my monument. That's what I built. My father did the finances, his whole marriage, every bill, every check, until he got sick. He was proud of that account the way other men are proud of a car. So when I ran the rough math on what his assets should be, and then I looked at the fact that a self-pay balance was climbing on his hospital account because apparently nobody was paying it, I hit a wall I couldn't explain. If my father had that retirement account, there was no reason on earth for a self-pay balance to be sitting there growing. You'd draw it down. You'd pay the bill. That's what the account was for. Unless the account wasn't there anymore. I filed that thought in the manila folder next to the sticky notes, and I told myself I was being paranoid, and I kept paying. January, February, March. Every couple of weeks, whatever I could move. By the end of March, I had paid a little over $31,000 toward my father's treatment, and not one member of my family knew it, because I had asked Rosa to keep the payer information confidential on the account, which she could do, which meant that as far as my mother knew, some balance was mysteriously getting smaller, and she didn't have to think about why. If you're wondering whether it hurt that nobody knew, that nobody thanked me, that my mother was at that very moment telling my cousins I hadn't so much as sent a card, then you already understand this story better than most of my family ever will. Yes, it hurt. It hurt like holding your hand over a flame to keep a fire going, that other people are warming themselves at, while they curse your name. But I want you to notice something, and I want you to hold on to it, because my mother never once figured it out. I wasn't paying for credit. If I'd wanted credit, I'd have made a scene. I was paying because I'd decided, sitting in that parking garage in December, that my father was going to get one more spring, and nobody's opinion of me was going to change that math. That's the woman my mother pointed at and called an abandoner. Keep her in mind. In February, something happened that I almost didn't tell you, because it's the most foolish thing I did in the whole 8 months, and it nearly cost me everything before I'd even started. I went to see him. I couldn't stand it anymore. I'd been paying for 8 weeks, and picturing him in a room I'd never seen. And one Tuesday, I got in my car, and I drove to St. Brendan's, and I went up to the oncology floor, and I told the nurse at the desk I was there to see my father, and I gave his name. And the nurse, a kind woman who had no idea she was holding a knife, looked at her screen, and her face changed, and she said, "Are you Monica?" And I said yes, my whole chest opening up because someone knew my name, and she said gently, so gently, "I'm sorry, honey. There's a note on the account. Immediate family only, and you're listed as, she didn't want to say it. Estranged, not to be given information. I'm sorry, I can't even confirm he's a patient here." I stood at that desk while a stranger read me out of my own father's life off a computer screen. And the worst part, the part that still gets me, is that I'd been paying that hospital thousands of dollars a month, and the same building that took my money to keep him alive had a note in its system saying I wasn't allowed to know if he was breathing. My mother had thought of everything. She'd built the wall in writing. I drove home, and I didn't cry. I'd already gotten good at that. And I got out my laptop, and I made another payment, $6,000, that same night, out of spite, if you want the truth, out of the purest spite I have ever felt, because it was the only door she'd left me, and I was going to keep walking through it whether she liked it or not. Here's the mini arc I want you to have, though, because it's the one that first made me sure something was wrong. Wrong in a way that went past cruelty into something with a motive. About a week after the desk turned me away, my brother Danny called me. Danny and I hadn't really talked since the co-signing thing, since the restaurant. But Danny called, and Danny is not a bad person. Danny is a weak person, which is different, and I've made my peace with the difference. He called to ask me for money. Not for himself. For Dad. He said Mom had told him the treatment was going to bankrupt the family, that they were going to lose the house, that Dad might not get the transplant he needed because insurance was fighting them and there was no money. And could I please, for once, think of someone besides myself and help? And I sat there holding the phone, because I had, at that point, paid roughly $40,000. And there was no self-pay balance in crisis. The balance was shrinking. I was shrinking it. And I knew the transplant hadn't even been scheduled yet, because they were still waiting on a donor match, which has nothing to do with money. Everything Danny had just said was false. Not exaggerated. False. Someone had sat my little brother down and told him a story with specific, frightening, invented details. We're going to lose the house. Insurance is fighting us. And Danny believed it because it came from Mom, and Mom was the voice of the house. I didn't tell Danny I'd been paying. I want you to notice that, because I've asked myself 100 times whether that was a mistake, and I've decided it wasn't, because Danny couldn't keep a secret from our mother to save his life. And if I'd told him, she'd have known within the hour that money was coming from me. And I don't know what she'd have done. But I know now that she'd have done something. So I just asked Danny questions, careful ones. What did the insurance letter say? Had he seen it? What did the hospital's financial office say? Had he called them? And Danny couldn't answer a single one, because there were no letters, there were no calls, there was only Mom at the kitchen table saying we're going to lose everything. In a house that, I would later learn, had a home equity line on it drained down to the studs. That was the night the shape of it first came to me, and I hope you feel it the way I did, cold and slow. My mother was telling two different lies to two different audiences. To the relatives, she was saying the treatment was covered, and I was the cheap one who wouldn't help. To Danny, she was saying we were going bankrupt and needed money. To the hospital, she was saying she couldn't afford to consent. 3 stories, and the only way all 3 stories are true at once is if there is no money. If the money that should be there is gone, and if every version of the lie is a different bucket she's holding out for someone to fill. I didn't have proof yet. I just had the shape. But I'm a person who looks at numbers for a living, and I know what it looks like when someone is running from a hole instead of toward a goal. And by February, I knew my mother was running from a hole. I just didn't know yet how deep it was, or that my father's life was what she'd throw in it to fill it. I called Rosa the next day, and I asked her one careful question, the only one she could answer without breaking any law. I asked whether the account had ever had a financial assistance application started on it, because if the family truly couldn't pay, someone would have applied. It's the first thing you do. And Rosa went quiet, and then she said, in the tone we use with each other when we're saying more than we're allowed to, no one's ever applied, and I flagged it twice, because with charges like these, that's unusual. Somebody was told, more than once, that help was available, And somebody said no thank you. Somebody said no thank you to free money for a dying man. You don't say no thank you to that, unless applying would put your own finances in front of someone who'd start asking where they went. I thanked Rosa, and I made another payment, and I started keeping the statements. All of them. Not just the sticky notes, the full itemized statements. Because some quiet part of me had already understood that a day was coming when I'd need to prove not just what I'd done, but what she had. In April, my father went into remission after his induction chemo, and for about 9 days, I let myself believe the worst was over. Then the numbers came back, and the doctors used a word I already knew from 100 desks and 100 bad afternoons. Relapse. Acute myeloid leukemia that comes back after induction is a different animal. Chemo alone wasn't going to hold it. What he needed, the only thing that gives a man his age a real shot, is an allogeneic stem cell transplant. New bone marrow from a matched donor. It's brutal, and it's dangerous, and it is also, for the right patient, a cure. Not a remission. A cure. There was one problem, and it wasn't the one my mother would later stand in a room and scream about. The problem was finding a donor. My father had no living siblings, and the family pool didn't match. So his transplant team submitted him to the National Registry to search for a matched unrelated donor, and then everyone did the hardest thing in medicine, which is wait. While they waited, I kept paying, and I started doing something else. I started calling, not my mother. I want to be precise about this, because my mother's whole case against me rests on a picture of a daughter who vanished. And I need you to see that the daughter never vanished, she was just never let in the door. I called the oncology social worker at St. Brendan's. I called the nurse coordinator on the transplant unit, a woman named Priya, who couldn't tell me protected health information, but could take a message. Every couple of weeks, I left the same message. This is Monica, his daughter. I'm handling some of the financial side. Please tell him I called. Please tell him I love him. I have no idea if a single one of those messages ever reached my father, because between him and me stood my mother, and my mother was the switchboard. She screened his calls. She sat by his bed. She told the nurses which family members were welcome and which ones were, and I'm quoting a note that later came out. Estranged and not to be given information. That was me. Estranged and not to be given information. She'd put it in writing to the hospital that I was not to be told how my father was doing. And then she went home and told my aunts that I never called. Here's your second open loop, and I want you to carry it with me, because it's the one that broke my heart when I finally understood it. Why would a devoted wife, a woman raising money for her husband's treatment, tell a hospital in writing that his own daughter should be kept in the dark? Devotion doesn't build walls like that. Something else does. Hold that. In June, the registry found a match. A matched unrelated donor. A stranger somewhere in the world, willing to give a piece of themselves to a man they'd never meet. When Priya's team got the confirmation, my father's transplant went from a someday to a date. These donor matches are not permanent. Donors have lives, schedules. The medical window when a patient is healthy enough to survive a transplant, but sick enough to need one, is narrow. When a match comes through, you move. The transplant team wanted to admit him and begin the conditioning regimen within about 2 weeks. And that is the exact moment the fundraiser was announced. I found out about it the way I found out about everything in my family that year. Secondhand and too late. My cousin Trevor, of all people, the one who gasped, posted about it. A community fundraiser for my uncle, battling cancer. Every dollar helps. And a photo of my father looking gray and small in a hospital gown. A photo taken without any dignity at all. And a caption my mother had clearly written. Fighting for his life while some walk away. Some walk away. That was me, immortalized in a caption. tagged in nothing but implied. The fundraiser was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in his hospital room on the oncology floor, with the relatives invited to come pay their respects and their donations. In 2 years, my mother had never once invited me to see my dying father. She invited me to the fundraiser. Do you understand what that means? She invited me because a villain who shows up is worth more than a villain who stays home. She needed me in that room. I was the visual aid. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that because if this were a movie, I'd have marched in with my chin up and a plan. I didn't have a plan. I sat in my car in that same parking garage where I'd made the first payment in December, and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry in 11 days, and then I did the only thing I know how to do when I'm frightened. I gathered my documents. By July, I had paid, in total, $63,412 toward my father's treatment. I had a folder full of confirmation numbers, and because I'd requested them, itemized statements from St. Brendan's showing the balance and the payments applied against it, with a line I had asked Rosa about specifically, payer of record. On those statements, in the payer of record field, for payment after payment after payment, was one name, Monica Atwood. Me. The most recent statement was dated 11 days before the fundraiser. On it, the treatment to date balance for the completed induction and the current inpatient charges read, in the box at the bottom, a number and a single word. The word was paid. I printed that statement. I folded it into quarters. I put it in the inside pocket of my coat. And I drove to the hospital to attend my own execution. Before I take you into that room, I want to ask you to do something for me. Because we've arrived at the moment the whole story turns on, and I don't want you to miss it. In the comments, tell me what you would have done. Would you have walked into that room? Would you have stayed home? Would you have brought the folder, or would you have brought a lawyer, or would you have finally, after 2 years, brought your voice? There's no wrong answer. I just want to know I wasn't the only one who ever had to decide whether to defend themselves in a room that had already made up its mind. Now let me show you the room. The oncology floor at St. Brendan's smells like antiseptic and warm laundry. And, underneath it, something sweet and sick that I've learned to associate with the very ill. My father's room was on the end, a corner room, which meant it was bigger than the others, which meant my mother had chosen it, because my mother always chose the biggest version of everything and called it love. There were maybe 18 people crowded in there when I arrived. My Aunt Deborah, my Uncle Ray, Trevor and his mother, 2 of my father's old Union brothers, big men holding their caps in their hands, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Because dying is embarrassing to men like that, and they didn't know where to put their eyes. And in the middle of it, my mother, in a navy dress, with a little gold cross at her throat, running the room like a wedding planner. She saw me come in. Everyone saw her see me come in. That was the point. My father was in the bed, and I have to tell you, the sight of him took my knees out from under me. I hadn't seen him in a year and a half. The man in that bed was 2/3 the size of the man who'd handed me wire nuts. His skin had gone the color of a paper bag. He had a knit cap on because the chemo had taken his hair, and his hands, those enormous electrician's hands that could bend conduit like it was licorice, lay on the blanket like they belonged to someone else. He was awake. He was looking at me, and I couldn't read his face at all. My mother let the silence build. She was good at silence. And then, when she judged that everyone had noticed me standing there, she lifted one hand toward me, palm up, like she was presenting evidence to a jury, and she said it. She abandoned her sick father. The room did the thing rooms do. It went quiet in a way that has weight. Deborah looked at the floor. Trevor gasped. One of the Union brothers cleared his throat and studied his cap. My mother wasn't finished. She never was. 2 years, she said, and her voice caught in exactly the right place. She'd practiced. I could tell she'd practiced. 2 years this man raised her, put a roof over her head, paid for that fancy schooling she thinks makes her better than us. And when he needed her, when he was lying here fighting for every breath, where was she? Not a call, not a card, not a dollar. So we're here, the people who actually love him, to do what she wouldn't. And she reached down beside the bed and lifted up the basket. I have thought about that basket more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life. It was wicker, with a blue gingham lining, the kind of thing you'd use for a bake sale. And she started it around the room herself, dropping in the first bill, 100, so everyone would know the going rate. And then it went hand to hand, and every person who put money in looked at me while they did it. That was the ritual. Pay and glare, pay and glare. My Aunt Deborah put in 2 20s and said loud enough for the room, "For a man who deserved better children." I said nothing. I want you to understand that I said nothing, not because I had no words, but because I finally understood what the room was. It was a stage, and my mother had written every line, including mine. She wanted me to defend myself. She wanted me to say, "That's not true." So she could say, of course she'd deny it. She wanted me to cry so she could say crocodile tears. She wanted me to storm out so she could say, "See how she abandons him again." Every reaction I could have had was already written into her script with a rebuttal attached. There was only one thing I could do that she hadn't scripted. I could tell the truth without saying a single word. The basket came to me last, the way the worst thing at a dinner always comes to you last. My mother's sister held it out to me with 2 fingers, and I reached into my coat, and I took out the folded statement, soft at the creases. And I did not make a speech, and I did not point at anyone, and I dropped it into the basket on top of the 20s and the 100s and the folded checks. My mother smiled. She actually smiled, because in her script, a folded piece of paper meant I was too cheap to give cash, and that was even better than a scene. "A note," she said to the room, "sweet as poison." She brought a note instead of helping. Isn't that just like her? I turned around and I walked out. Not fast. I walked out the way you walk out of a church. And I went and sat in the family waiting room down the hall. And I waited, because I knew something my mother didn't. I knew what happens to the contents of a fundraising basket on a hospital oncology floor. I knew because it's my job to know. The staff don't let cash sit in a patient room. A nurse collects it, counts it, and logs it, usually to the patient's account or to a hospital foundation with a witness. Because unattended cash in a hospital is a liability nightmare. Someone was going to empty that basket, and someone was going to unfold my note to make sure it wasn't a check that needed depositing. I sat in that waiting room for 51 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. And at the end of the 51 minutes, a nurse I didn't recognize came down the hall, walking fast. And she wasn't carrying a basket. She was carrying my folded statement. Open now, held flat in both hands, the way you carry something you don't want to spill. And she didn't come to me. She walked past me to the nurse's station, and she said something to the charge nurse, and the charge nurse picked up a phone. 9 minutes after that, my father's attending physician, the head of his transplant team, a tall woman named Dr. Okafor, whose name I knew from Priya's messages, came out of the elevator with the nurse and went into my father's room. And she did not go in gently. She went in with her jaw set. And 30 seconds later, she came back out, and behind her came my mother, and Dr. Okafor said, in a voice pitched low, but not low enough, "Mrs. Atwood, step into the hallway with me, please." Now, that's where I have to pause, because everything before this moment, I've told you as a story, a thing that already happened, safe in the past. But the next part I didn't understand yet. I only saw it. I saw my mother's face when the doctor said, "Now." My mother had a face for every occasion: a grief face, a martyr face, a wronged mother face. I had seen all of them, but the face she made when Dr. Okafor said, "Step into the hallway," was one I had never seen on her in 31 years. It was fear, naked animal fear. And I sat in that waiting room chair, and I thought, with a coldness that surprised me, that is not the face of a woman who's been caught fundraising for a bill that's already paid. That is the face of a woman who's been caught at something much worse. I was right. And what it was is going to change everything. So if you're still with me, this is the point where you'll want to stay. Because the story you think you've been listening to, the story of a daughter proving she paid, is over. A different and much darker story is about to start, and my father's life is inside it. Dr. Okafor took my mother into a small consult room off the hall and closed the door, and I could not hear what was said. But I could see the door, and I watched it, the way you watch a pot you know is going to boil. It stayed closed for 20 minutes, and when it opened, my mother came out first. And she was not crying, she was white, gray-white, the color my father was, and she did not look at me at all. She walked to the elevator, and she pressed the button, and she stood there with her back to the whole floor, and when the doors opened, she got in, and she was gone. My mother left her own husband's fundraiser. She left the room, full of relatives she'd summoned. That, more than anything, is when I knew. Dr. Okafor came out of the consult room next, and she looked down the hall, and she saw me sitting there, and something crossed her face. Recognition, because Priya had described me, or because the payer name on that statement matched the daughter the mother had banned. She walked over. She sat down in the chair next to mine, which doctors don't do unless they've decided you're a person and not a problem. And she said, "You're Monica." I said I was. She said, "You've been paying his bills." I said I had. And then she said the sentence that turned my whole understanding of the last 8 months inside out. She said, "Then you need to know that money was never the reason your father hasn't had his transplant." I didn't understand. I said, "The donor match, the window, the 2 weeks. I know the window is closing." And Dr. Okafor shook her head slowly, and she said, "The window isn't the problem either. We have a matched donor. We have a bed. His counts are right now as good as they're going to get. Financially, thanks to you, his account is clear. There is exactly one thing standing between your father and the transplant that could cure him." She paused. She looked at the closed door of my father's empty room. "We need consent. And your father, when his counts drop, drifts in and out of the kind of confusion where we can't legally take it from him directly. So for the medical decisions, he has a healthcare proxy, a person who signs for him when he can't sign for himself. And that person has refused to consent to the transplant for 6 weeks. She keeps telling us he can't afford it, and she won't gamble the family's money on a long shot. We kept telling her it was covered. She kept saying she'd have to see the money first." Dr. Okafor's jaw tightened. "The proxy is your mother, and your statement, the one you dropped in that basket, is the first proof I've had in 6 weeks that the money she said didn't exist has been sitting there, paid, the whole time. I want to tell you that I gasped, or cried, or stood up. I didn't. I went very still. The way you go still when the ground you're standing on turns out to be over a drop. Because I'm a person who reads statements for a living. And I had just been handed the one number that made every other number make sense. My mother had a healthcare proxy over my father. My mother had refused a curative transplant for 6 weeks, telling the doctors he couldn't afford it. My mother knew, because I'd made sure the balance was shrinking, that money was coming from somewhere. My mother had put in writing that his daughter was to be kept in the dark. My mother had staged a public fundraiser to raise money for a treatment she was simultaneously refusing to authorize. None of that makes sense if my mother wanted my father cured. All of it makes perfect sense if my mother needed my father to stay exactly as sick as he was. Not dead, not well, sick, dependent, confused enough that she held the pen. And I remembered the retirement account, the monument. 40 years I put in that account. And the self-pay balance that had no business existing if that account were still full. And I understood, sitting in a plastic chair on the oncology floor, that I had spent $63,000 keeping my father alive, and my mother had spent 6 weeks trying to make sure being alive did him no good. And the reason for all of it, was money that was already gone. Before I tell you what I did next, and I did a great deal next, I need you to make a prediction, because we've reached the middle of this, and the second half is a race. Here's the question. If your parents' life depended on getting a signature away from the one person legally allowed to give it, and that person had every reason to keep withholding it, what would you do? Comment your answer. Would you fight the proxy in court, which takes weeks he didn't have? Would you try to prove he was competent enough to sign for himself? Would you go looking for the money, or would you go looking for the truth? I did some of all of it, and I got some of it wrong, and I want to know what you'd have tried. Now let me show you how a financial counselor fights for a life instead of a bill. The first thing I did was the thing my whole family would have least expected, which is, I didn't chase my mother. Every instinct I had wanted to go home and confront her, wanted to stand in her kitchen and make her look at that statement and admit what she'd done. But confrontation is what my mother was good at. Confrontation is a stage, and she owned the stage, so I didn't get on it. Instead, I asked Dr. Okafor a question, the only question that mattered. I said, if my father were found to have decision-making capacity, could he consent to the transplant himself over the proxy's objection? And Dr. Okafor, who I could see was starting to realize that the abandoning daughter was not what she'd been told, said, yes. A proxy only speaks when the patient can't. If he has capacity, his decision is the only one that counts. But capacity has to be formally evaluated, and his counts fluctuate, and his proxy has been telling us for weeks that he's too confused to know his own mind. There it was. The whole game in one sentence. My mother's power over my father was built on a story that he couldn't think for himself. And the terrible thing about that kind of story is that if you tell it to enough nurses on enough bad afternoons, it starts to look true. Because a sick man on the wrong medication on his worst day does look confused, and nobody's there on his good mornings to see him do the crossword. So I asked for a formal capacity evaluation. I didn't have the standing to order one, but I knew the magic words, and I said them to the right person, the oncology social worker, whose name was Marcus, who I found in his office 20 minutes later. I said, I'm concerned that this patient's proxy has a financial conflict of interest and is not acting in his medical interest, and I'm requesting a capacity evaluation and a review of the proxy under your ethics process. Those aren't words that come from a grieving daughter. Those are words that come from someone who has sat on the other side of that desk. Marcus looked at me differently after I said them. He asked me how I knew the language. I told him it was my job. And then I did the second thing, which is I opened my folder on his desk. I want to describe what was in that folder, because this is the part of the story where the paper I'd been collecting for 8 months stopped being a shield and became a weapon. There were the itemized statements, payer of record, Monica Atwood, running back to December. There were the confirmation numbers on their yellow sticky notes. There was the fundraiser post, printed out, fighting for his life while some walk away. And there was the thing I'd been afraid to look at since April, the thing about the retirement account. I hadn't proven anything about the account, but I'd noticed the hole where it should have been. And now, sitting in Marcus's office, I said out loud, for the first time, the sentence I'd been carrying. I said. My father had a retirement account he spent 40 years building. He talked about it constantly. If it still existed, there is no financial reason on earth for this treatment to have been in doubt for a single day. I think it's gone. I think that's why my mother needs him confused, because a confused man doesn't ask to see the statements, and a dead man never finds out at all. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, I can't act on a theory, but I can order a capacity evaluation, because that's a medical question, and I have grounds, and I'm required by law to report suspected financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult to Adult Protective Services. What you've just described, if any part of it is true, is exactly that. He picked up his phone. I'm making the report. You should know that once I do, this stops being a family disagreement and becomes an investigation. There's no taking it back. I told him to make the call. And that was the moment, if you want to know, that I stopped being the villain of my family and became the thing my mother had always accused me of being. And I never was until she made me one. I became the daughter who would burn it all down. The difference is I did it to save him, not to spend him. She never could tell those two things apart. That was always her problem. The capacity evaluation was scheduled for the next morning, and I was not allowed to be in the room, which was correct, because if my father was going to be found competent, it could not look like I'd coached him. So I spent the night in a hotel across from the hospital, not sleeping, running scenarios the way I run payment plans, and at 9 the next morning, a psychiatrist named Dr. Bell spent an hour with my father on a morning when his counts happened to be decent, and asked him the date and the president, and what a stem cell transplant was, and whether he understood that it might kill him, and that not having it almost certainly would. And my father, who had bent conduit like licorice, answered every question. He knew where he was. He knew what was wrong with him. And when Dr. Bell asked him whether he understood that his wife had been declining the transplant on his behalf, my father, according to the note I later read, went quiet for a long time and then said, She's been telling me we can't afford it. She's been telling me the kids don't call. The kids, plural. There it was, the lie I'd been living inside for 2 years, said out loud by the man it had been used against. She'd been telling him nobody called. She'd been the wall, and then she'd told the man behind the wall that no one was knocking. Dr. Bell found him to have full decision-making capacity, and the second she signed that finding, my mother's proxy went silent. Not revoked. Not yet, that would come. But silent, because a proxy only speaks when the patient can't. And my father, that morning, could. But my mother was not a woman who lost quietly, and here is where the second half of this becomes the fight it was. Because that afternoon, she came back to the hospital, and she came back with a lawyer. I saw them arrive from the waiting room, the same waiting room. I'd practically moved into it. My mother had changed clothes and repaired her face, and beside her was a man in a gray suit, carrying a briefcase. And I watched them go to the nurse's station, and I watched my mother's finger point and jab, and I heard, because she'd stopped being able to control her volume, the words confused and unstable, and my husband is not in his right mind, and I have his medical power of attorney. She was going to fight the capacity finding. She was going to argue that the one good morning was a fluke, that her husband was too sick to know his own mind, that she, his devoted wife of 34 years, knew better than a psychiatrist who'd spent 1 hour with him. And the terrible thing, the thing that made my hands go cold, is that she might win, because she was his wife, and the world tilts toward the wife. And every day this took was a day the donor window closed further. I need you to understand the clock now, because the clock is the whole second half. Dr. Okafor had told me the matched donor was ready, but a donor's availability is measured in days, and the conditioning regimen my father needed before the transplant, the chemo, and radiation that wipes out the old marrow to make room for the new, takes about 10 days and has to be timed to the donor's collection. If we lost this donor to delay, finding another match could take months. My father did not have. My mother didn't have to win her fight. She only had to make it long enough. So it became a race between a woman who needed to run out the clock and a woman who reads clocks for a living. And my mother's first move in that race was one I did not see coming, because it was smarter and colder than anything I'd given her credit for. 2 days after the capacity finding, I got a call from Priya, the transplant coordinator, and Priya's voice was tight. She said, "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you need to know. Your mother has requested a transfer. She wants him moved to a facility across the state, closer to home," she says, "so the family can be near him. She's filed the paperwork this morning." I understood it instantly, and I had to sit down. A transfer sounds like love. Closer to home, near the family. Who could argue with that? But I read clocks for a living, and here's what a transfer actually was. My father's matched donor was tied to St. Brendan's transplant program, to their collection schedule, to their beds. Moving him to a hospital 4 hours away meant a new transplant team, a new evaluation, a new place in a new line, and, critically, weeks of delay, while the donor window closed and closed and closed. A transfer would not stop the transplant, on paper. It would just make it impossible in time. She wasn't refusing the cure anymore, now that refusing had stopped working. She was going to make the cure arrive too late to matter, and she was going to do it wearing the face of a wife who just wanted her husband closer to home. I have never in my life been more frightened of a piece of paperwork. But here's the thing my mother kept forgetting. Over and over, right up to the end. A transfer of a competent adult patient requires the patient's consent. And my father, that week, was competent. So her transfer request wasn't a decision she could make for him anymore. It was a request she could make on his behalf, and he could refuse. Which meant the whole thing came down, again, to whether my father would choose me or her, and she still had one advantage I couldn't erase with any folder, which is that she was in that room every day, and I was allowed in for 1 hour at a time, under a nurse's eye. And 34 years is a long time to learn how to talk to a man when he's frightened at 3 a.m. So I did the only thing I could. I couldn't outlast her at his bedside. But I could make sure the decision got made in daylight, on paper, in front of witnesses, before she could work on him in the dark. I went to Marcus, and I said the transfer request had to go through the competent patient, that it could not be executed on a proxy signature, given the open capacity finding and the open APS case. And Marcus agreed, and the hospital's counsel agreed, because a hospital that transfers a vulnerable adult out from under an active exploitation investigation is a hospital that ends up in the newspaper. The transfer got frozen pending the ethics committee, which meant my mother's clever move had done the one thing she least wanted. It had put everything in front of the committee, faster, with the transfer and the transplant and the proxy all on the same table on the same Friday. She'd tried to run out the clock, and instead, she'd wound it tighter. I almost felt something like pity, watching a person be that certain, right up to the second the floor gave way, that her stories would keep holding. Here's what I did, and I'm going to walk you through it step by step, because I'm proud of it, and because I want you to see that I never once used a trick. I only ever used the truth faster than she could bury it. Step 1. I could not stop my mother from challenging the capacity finding, but I could make sure the challenge was heard by the hospital's ethics committee immediately, that same week, instead of dragging into a court battle that would take the month we didn't have. And I could do that because I knew the ethics process existed, and I knew how to invoke it, which my mother's expensive lawyer it turned out. Did not, because he was a real estate attorney, the only kind my mother could afford on short notice, which told me something too. So I went back to Marcus, and I said the magic words again. Time-sensitive, curative treatment, proxy with a documented financial conflict, patient with a fresh capacity finding. Convene the committee, and the committee was convened for that Friday. Step 2. The committee was going to hear 2 stories. My mother's story was that her husband was too confused to decide, and she, his loving wife, was protecting him from a dangerous gamble. My story needed to be better than a story. It needed to be numbers. So I did the thing my mother had spent 2 years mocking me for being able to do. I built the case in paper. I already had the hospital statements proving the treatment was paid and that the payer was me, which detonated the "we can't afford it" claim on contact. But I needed the other half, the half that answered the question the committee would ask, which is, if the wife isn't refusing over money, why is she refusing? And to answer that, I needed to prove the money was gone, and that she was the reason. Now, I could not subpoena my father's bank records, but my father could authorize the release of his own records, and my father, that week, had been found to have capacity. So I did not go around him. I went to him. For the first time in a year and a half, I walked into my father's room, and I sat down in the chair by his bed, the chair my mother had sat in to screen his calls, and I introduced myself to my own father, like a stranger. Because after 2 years of her stories, that's what I was to him. I'm not going to pretend that conversation was clean. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, in a voice like gravel, "Your mother says you didn't call." And I put the folder on the bed, and I opened it to the statements, and I put my finger on the payer field, on my own name, printed there 20 times. December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. And I said, "Dad, I called every 2 weeks. I've been paying for all of it since December. She told the hospital not to tell you. She told the hospital not to tell me how you were. And I need you to authorize the release of your bank records, because I think she took your retirement account. And I think that's why she'd rather you stay sick than get the transplant that would let you find out." My father was a quiet man. He didn't yell. He didn't cry, not then. He read the folder. He read it the way he used to read a wiring diagram, slow, top to bottom, his finger moving. And when he got to the end, he closed it, and he looked at his own hands, those hands, and he said 2 words. He said, "wire nuts." And I thought he'd gotten confused after all, and my heart dropped. And then he said, "You used to hand me wire nuts out of the bucket, and you got to keep the empty ones. You remember that?" And I said I did. And he said, "So do I. I never forgot it. I just got tired of the noise." And then my father signed the release for his bank records, and he asked me to find out where his monument had gone. That's the end of the first race. And I'll tell you what the records showed. But first, if this is landing anywhere near where you live, if you've ever been the one who got tired of nobody knowing the truth, take 1 second and hit like, because these stories don't get shown to people like us, unless people like you do. And I'd rather this reach 1 more person who needed it than 100 who didn't. The bank records took 2 days, and Marcus helped me get them expedited through the APS investigation, which was now open and had its own authority. And when they came, they told a story so simple and so ugly that I sat in the hotel room and put my hand over my mouth. My father's retirement account, the monument, the 40 years, had held $181,000 in January of the year before. Over the 18 months that followed, in withdrawals of $8,000 and $9,000 at a time, spaced out just enough to stay under the threshold that triggers an automatic review, it had been drained to $400. Every withdrawal, authorized by the account's joint holder. My mother. The money had gone to a second account I'd never heard of, and from there, the trail got complicated in a way I didn't have time to fully unwind before Friday. Credit card balances, cash withdrawals, a series of payments to a man whose name meant nothing to me, and everything to my Aunt Deborah when I finally showed her. But that's a different, sadder story, and it isn't mine to tell. What mattered for Friday was this. My father had been told his whole illness that he couldn't afford to be cured. And the reason he couldn't afford it was that the woman telling him had already spent the cure. And the transplant that would make him well was also the transplant that would make him lucid, and a lucid electrician, who did his own finances for 40 years, was going to open his account the first week he was strong enough and find $400 where his monument used to be. My mother wasn't refusing the transplant, despite the risk to his life. She was refusing it because of the risk to hers. The night before the committee, I got a phone call from my mother's lawyer. The real estate lawyer? He'd gotten my number from Danny, I found out later, before Danny came all the way over to the truth. And he called me at 9 at night, and he used the smooth voice, the one they teach them. And he said he thought we were all getting ahead of ourselves, that this was a family matter, that these things were so painful for everyone, and that his client was prepared to be reasonable. And then he made the offer, and the offer told me everything about how frightened my mother already was. He said if I would withdraw my report to Adult Protective Services and my request to change the proxy, his client would agree to consent to the transplant. In other words, she would let my father have the cure I'd already paid for, the cure she'd blocked for 6 weeks, if, and only if, I agreed to bury what she'd done to his account. She was trying to trade my father's life for her cover. She was holding the thing she'd stolen and offering to stop holding a knife to a second thing if I'd agree not to look in the drawer. And I want to tell you that I had a speech ready, but I didn't. I just felt something in me go very quiet and very clear, the way it does at my desk when a family finally understands the number and stops arguing with it. And I said, you should tell your client 2 things. 1, the transplant isn't hers to consent to anymore because he's competent, so she has nothing to trade. And 2, the report to APS isn't mine to withdraw. I don't own it. Once it's made, it belongs to the state. That's how it's designed, specifically so that people like your client can't buy it back from people like me. And there was a silence on the line, and then the lawyer said, quieter, not smooth anymore. You understand this is going to destroy her. And I said, no, what she did to her own husband is going to destroy her. I just stopped agreeing to hide it. And I hung up, and I sat in the dark of that hotel room. And I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest. I felt sick. Because a part of me was still, even then, the little girl handing up wire nuts, still wanting there to be a version of this, where my mother was a person who could be reasoned back from the edge. There wasn't. There never had been. But it took me until 9 o'clock the night before the end to stop reaching for it. If you're still reaching for your version of that, I understand. Just don't let the reaching cost you the folder. Friday, the Ethics Committee. I have sat on the staff side of a lot of hospital conference rooms, and I never once imagined I'd sit on the family side of one with my whole life on the table. The room had a long table and bad carpet, and a box of tissues in the center that somebody puts there on purpose. On one side sat the committee, Dr. Okafor, Dr. Bell the psychiatrist, Marcus, an ethicist, a nurse manager, and the hospital's counsel. On the other side sat my mother and her real estate lawyer, and they let me be there, at Marcus's insistence, because I was the one who'd made the report, and because my father had asked for me. They wheeled my father in. That was my mother's first bad moment, and I watched it hit her. She had built her entire case on the premise that he was too confused to be in the room. And there he was, in the room, in a wheelchair, with an IV pole. thin as a rail, but sitting up, in a clean shirt, someone me had brought him, with his knit cap on and his eyes clear. It was a good morning. God, it was a good morning. Now I'm going to give you the reveal the way it happened, because it happened in steps, and each step took the floor out from under my mother one board at a time, and I want you to feel the boards go. Step 1, the lie. My mother's lawyer opened, because that's how these go, and he said his client was a devoted wife of 34 years who was being railroaded by an estranged daughter and an overzealous social worker, that Mr. Atwood was gravely ill and not competent to make this decision, and that his client, as healthcare proxy, was simply trying to protect her husband and her family from a financially ruinous procedure with no guarantee of success. He said the word abandoned about me. He said it twice. He'd been briefed by my mother, and my mother only had the one story. Step 2, the evidence. When it was my turn, I didn't make a speech. I'd learned in that hospital room with the basket what speeches got me. I slid folders down the table, one to each committee member, and I said, "Everything I'm about to say is on paper in front of you, so you don't have to take my word for any of it." Tab 1 is the itemized statement of my father's account at this hospital. Please look at the payer of record. I waited while they turned to it. It's me. Every payment since December. Tab 1 also shows the current balance. It says paid. My father's treatment has not been in financial doubt for a single day since the 4th of December, because I have been paying for it. Which means when my mother told this committee for 6 weeks that she couldn't consent because the family couldn't afford it, that was not true, and the proof was in your billing system the entire time. Step 3, the denial. My mother's lawyer said I could have been paying for anything, that a paid balance didn't prove intent. My mother nodded, and she found her voice, and she said, in her grief tone, "She's twisting this. I never said we couldn't pay. I said I wasn't sure. I was frightened. Any wife would be frightened." She was recalibrating in real time. She was good. I'd always known she was good. Step 4, the stronger evidence. So I opened tab 2. Tab 2, I said, is my father's retirement account, which he authorized the release of on Tuesday, after Dr. Bell found him competent to authorize things. 18 months ago, it held $181,000. Today, it holds $400. Every withdrawal was authorized by its joint holder. That's my mother. The money did not go to his treatment, because I was paying for his treatment. Tab 3 shows where some of it went. I'll let the APS investigator speak to the rest, because that's her jurisdiction now, not mine. And I closed my folder, because I'd learned that too. From my mother of all people, you stop talking when the paper is louder than you are. The room was very quiet. The ethicist was reading tab 2, with her glasses pushed up on her forehead. Dr. Okafor was looking at my mother with an expression I would not have wanted aimed at me. And my mother's lawyer, the real estate lawyer, leaned over and whispered something to his client. And I watched my mother shake her head, and I watched her realize, maybe for the first time, that she had brought a knife made of stories to a fight that had turned out to be made of numbers. Step 5, the final reveal. And this one wasn't mine. This one was my father's. Because the ethicist, doing her job, turned to my father, and she said gently, "Mr. Atwood, this is your decision, and I want to hear it from you. Do you understand what a stem cell transplant involves, including the risks?" And my father said yes, and he listed them, the way I'd heard him list the parts of a breaker panel when I was small. And she said, "And knowing the risks, do you want the transplant?" And my father looked, not at her, and not at me, but at my mother. He looked at his wife of 34 years, for a long, long moment. And then he said, "I want the transplant, and I want to know what happened to my account, because I built that account for 40 years, and my daughter's been paying my bills, and my wife's been telling me nobody calls. He turned to the committee. I'd like a new proxy. My daughter, if she'll take it. Step 6. The silence. My mother did not scream. I had braced for the scream. It never came. What came was worse. She sat there in her navy dress with the little gold cross, and her mouth opened, and nothing came out, because there was nothing in her whole enormous repertoire of stories that could survive her own husband, in his own clear voice, choosing the daughter she'd spent 2 years erasing. She looked at me, and for 1 second, the mask came all the way off, and what was underneath was not sorry. It was furious. It was the face of a woman watching a monument she'd stolen get handed back to the man she'd stolen it from. And then the mask came back down, because it always did, and she gathered her purse. Step 7. The loss of control. Her lawyer stood up and started to say something about revisiting this, about her rights, about a formal hearing, and the hospital's counsel said, evenly, "Sir, there's an open adult protective services investigation into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and a competent patient has just requested a change of proxy, which he's entitled to do. I'd advise your client to speak to a different kind of attorney." A different kind of attorney. I watched that land on my mother. A criminal one. He meant a criminal one, and everyone in the room knew it. And my mother knew it best of all. Step 8. The consequences. My mother left the room. She didn't look at my father. She didn't look at me. She walked out into the hallway, where 6 days earlier, Dr. Okafor had said, "Step into the hallway," and the whole thing had started to come apart. And this time nobody followed her, and the door closed, and it was the quietest sound I have ever heard. My father got his transplant 11 days later. The donor window held. The conditioning was as brutal as everyone promised, and there were 2 nights I truly thought we were going to lose him, and I slept in the chair, the proxy chair, the one my mother used to sit in. Except I sat in it to let him in, instead of to keep him out. On the second bad night, around 4 in the morning, he woke up and found me there, and he didn't say anything profound. My father never did. He just reached over with one of those big hands and put it on top of mine, and left it there until we both fell asleep. That was the conversation I'd been paying $63,000 for since December. It didn't take any words. It never would have. The recovery was its own long story, and I'll only tell you the parts that matter, because a transplant ward at 4 in the morning is not a place I'd wish on my worst enemy, and I've had a candidate. The conditioning wiped him out down to nothing. That's the point of it. You have to burn the field to plant the new crop, and for about 2 weeks my father had no immune system at all, which meant a mask and gown and gloves to sit with him, which meant I held his hand through 2 layers of latex, and learned to say what I meant with my eyes, over a mask, because that was all he could see of my face. He ran fevers that scared the residents. His new marrow took its time deciding whether to stay. And there is a thing called graft versus host disease that I had to learn about the hard way. And there were mornings I sat in the family room and did the math I do best, the cold math, the odds, and made myself look straight at the number that said he might not make it, so that if it came, I wouldn't be a person it's surprised. That's a thing you learn at my desk. You look at the bad number on purpose so it can't ambush you. I looked at it every morning, and every morning he was still there when I looked up. Danny came on the 9th day. I want to tell you about Danny, because Danny is where a lot of you live, in the space between the villain and the hero, in the place of the person who believed the lie, because believing it was easier than the fight. Danny came to the ward, and he didn't know I'd be there. Mom had stopped telling anyone anything by then, and he saw me in the gown and gloves, coming out of Dad's room, and he stopped dead in the hallway. And I watched him do the math on his own face, because Danny had been told I abandoned Dad. And here I was, gowned and gloved and gray under the eyes. Clearly not a visitor who'd dropped by once. Clearly someone who lived there. And Danny said, "How long have you been here?" And I said, "Since the transplant. Every day." And Danny said, "Mom said you." And then he stopped, because he was standing in a hallway, watching a sentence he'd repeated 100 times come apart in his hands. I didn't rescue him from it. I used to rescue Danny from things. That was our whole relationship. Me reading the fine print he didn't want to read. Me saying the hard number he didn't want to hear, and him resenting me for being the one who saw the trap he'd already stepped in. So I didn't rescue him. I just said, "I've been paying for his treatment since December, Danny. All of it. There was never any danger of losing the house over Dad's bills. I need you to sit with why you were told there was." And Danny sat down, right there on the floor of the transplant ward hallway, his back against the wall, a grown man in a leather jacket, and he put his face in his hands. And after a while he said, "She told me not to call you. She said you'd twist it. She said you always twist it." And I said, "I know. She told everyone that. It's how it works. You make the honest one sound like the liar first, and then you can say anything you want and nobody checks." Danny cried on that floor for a while. And then he got up, and he gowned up, and he went in and sat with our father. And he's been sitting with him ever since. So I'll give Danny this. When the story finally broke in his hands, he didn't run from the pieces. Not everyone in this family managed that. He did. The APS investigator was a woman named Ms. Reyes, and I met with her twice. And I want to tell you about her because she was the first person in official authority who looked at my folder and understood immediately what she was seeing. And there is a specific relief in being believed by someone whose job is not to believe people easily. She spread my statements across her desk, and the bank records, and the fundraiser post, and she didn't say, "This must be a misunderstanding." "Which is what everyone says," she said. "This is a textbook pattern. Structured withdrawals, under the reporting threshold, isolation of the victim from other family, control of information, a financial motive to prevent the victim's recovery. I've seen it 40 times. It almost never has this much paper. Do you have any idea how rare it is that someone kept the paper?" And I said, "It's my job to keep the paper." And Ms. Reyes looked at me for a second and said, "Then your father got very lucky in exactly the daughter your mother spent 2 years telling everyone was worthless." I've thought about that sentence a lot. The thing my mother mocked me for, the coldness, the counting, the folder, was the exact thing that saved his life. The trait she'd turned into my crime was the trait that undid her. There's a kind of justice in that so clean it almost frightens me. My mother tried one more time. Of course she did. On the 16th day, when Dad's counts were just starting to climb back, she came to the ward. I wasn't there. I was at work. I'd had to go back to work eventually. And she came and she asked to see her husband and the ward, which now had the ethics committee's decision and the APS case flagged all over his chart, called Dr. Okafor, and Dr. Okafor asked my father, who was awake, whether he wanted to see his wife. And my father, according to the nurse who told me later, with tears in her own eyes, thought about it for a long moment, and then said, "Not today. Maybe not ever." "Tell her I said to keep the wire nuts. She'll know what it means." He knew she wouldn't know what it meant. That was the point. It was a message that only I would understand, sent through her, so that she would have to carry a sentence she couldn't read to the one person who could, and know, standing at a nurse's station, being turned away from a man she'd tried to keep sick, that there was now a language in her own family that she was locked out of. My father was a quiet man. But quiet men keep accounts too, and when they finally settle them, they settle them all the way. Before I tell you where everyone landed, I want to say one thing to you directly, because if you've made it this far, You're the person I made this for. If you are somewhere right now, being cast as the villain in a story someone else is telling about your family, if you are the cold one, the difficult one, the one who asks the wrong questions and won't set themselves on fire on command, I need you to hear this. Asking the hard question is not the same as being cold. Reading the statement out loud is not the same as being cruel. Sometimes the person who loves the most is the one standing off to the side, keeping the lights on, while everyone else warms their hands and complains about the electric bill. Do not let anyone convince you that your steadiness is a lack of love. It might be the truest love in the room. Take a breath and forgive yourself for the times you stayed quiet. And then, when it counts, bring your folder. Here's where everyone landed because you deserve the ending. My father is in remission. Real remission, the transplant kind. The kind that gets to be called a cure if it holds for 5 years. And we're 1 year in. His hair came back, gray and curly, which it never was before. Apparently that happens. And he thinks it's the funniest thing that ever occurred to a human being. He did his own finances again as soon as he could sit up, and he opened the retirement account. And he looked at the $400 for a long time, and then he closed the laptop and he said, "Well, I built it once. I'm 64. I've got a few years to build something smaller." And he started over. My father, at 64, with a paper route of a pension, and a daughter who does his budgeting now because he asked me to, which is its own kind of monument if you think about it. The Adult Protective Services investigation became a police matter because 18 months of structured withdrawals from a vulnerable adult's account is not a family disagreement, it's a felony, and the man the money went to turned out to be exactly the kind of thing you're already imagining. And I'll leave it there, because my Aunt Deborah has to see him at the grocery store, and she suffered enough. My mother took a plea. She did not go to prison. At her age, and with restitution ordered, she got probation and a felony record, and a repayment schedule she'll be paying until she's 90, out of the Social Security she used to say was beneath her. My father did not press for more. She's going to spend the rest of her life, he said, being exactly who she always was, with everyone finally able to see it. That's the whole sentence. The judge just made it official. My mother and I have not spoken. She sent one letter, and it was 4 pages. And I read the first page, and it was about how I had destroyed the family, and how a good daughter would have kept it private, and how she'd only ever done what she did out of love. And I put it down, and I did not read pages 2 through 4, because I have finally learned the thing it took me 31 years and $63,000 to learn, which is that you cannot reason with a person whose entire self is a story in which they are always the one who loved the most and lost the most and got thanked the least. You can only stop being a character in it. So I closed the letter and I put it in the folder, the manila folder, the one with the sticky notes, which I keep now not as evidence but as a reminder. And I closed the folder and I closed that door gently, the way you close a door on a room you're not going back into. And the relatives, the ones with the basket, the ones who glared while they paid. Trevor apologized, actually apologized. A real one, no excuses. And I told him he was young, and his mother lied to him, and I didn't hold it against him, which is true. Aunt Deborah couldn't quite manage the words, but she started calling, and now she calls every Sunday, and we don't talk about the basket. We talk about my father's ridiculous curly hair, and that's its own kind of apology, I've decided. The Union brothers sent a card. It said, "We knew your dad was a good judge of people. Turns out he raised one too." I keep that one on the fridge. That one I read all the way through. Somebody asked me a few months ago whether I regret it. Whether if I could go back, I'd have just paid the bills quietly and let my mother have her fundraiser and her story, and kept the peace. And I thought about it because it's a fair question, and here's my answer. I don't regret the $63,000. I'd pay it again tomorrow, twice, for the 4 a.m. with his hand on mine. But I regret the 2 years before it. I regret every holiday I let her narrate me into the corner. I regret that I got so good at saying nothing that it took a basket in a hospital room to make me finally speak. And so, if there's one thing I want you to take from a woman who paid for her father's life while being called the one who abandoned him, it's this. Don't wait for the basket. If your family has decided who you are, and it isn't who you are, you don't owe them your silence to keep their peace. You can love them and still refuse to be the lie they need. Bring your voice. And if they won't hear your voice, then God help them. Bring your folder. My father asked me last week to hand him something out in the garage, and I reached into a bucket, and it was full of wire nuts, hundreds of them, brand new. And I looked at him, and he shrugged, and he said, "Figured I'd have some on hand. Never know when a kid's gonna want to keep the empty ones." I'm 32 now. I kept one anyway. It's on my desk, next to the folder I don't open. And every time I look at it, I remember that being the quiet one, the careful one, the one who reads the statement out loud was never the same thing as being cold. It was just love that knew how to count. Thanks for staying to the end. If this reached you, you know somebody who needs it. Send it to them. And if you're the one being called the villain right now, in some room, in some story, that isn't true, I hope you find your voice sooner than I found mine. It's never too late to hand your father his wire nuts, but it's a lot better if you don't wait for the basket.